look at those values on the one hand and then match those with organizational needs or conflicting business benefits or other issues. The other thing that we wanted to look at is what are the humanistic gains that we can retain and sustain after a crisis? So there is a lot of learning going on at the moment. And obviously the crisis perhaps is going on longer than we were hoping. But what are the key humanistic learning points that we can take that can inform our practice and research later on as well? So we decided to have a humanistic approach to this chapter as well. And we decided to identify different types of organizations in different types of sectors and just sort of touch base with leaders and take a snapshot of what the situation was during the first 4 to 6 months of the pandemic. Next slide, please, Ruth. Thank you. So we wanted to contextualize this a little bit because obviously a global pandemic has been lived worldwide in very different ways. And I've heard the saying that, we might all be under the same storm, but we're definitely not all in the same boat. So we just wanted to clarify that we are having an approach here that's based on a study in the UK. And obviously the timeline of COVID in the UK might be different from other places. And actually different government responses appeared in the 4 nations in the UK. So even in the UK context, we had different approaches to responses to the pandemic. But on the 31st of January, we had confirmation of the first 2 cases of COVID-19 in the UK. And then the situation escalated and we could really see the impact on businesses. So for example, on the 18th of March, the pound sterling fell below $1.18, which was the lowest ever since 1985. So the signs of a profound crisis appeared and made us very conscious of the need to react. And then on the 23rd of March, what was previously recommendations and guidelines in terms of social distancing became a legally mandatory lockdown. So the government issued a mandatory national lockdown on national television, and this forced individuals, groups, organizations to rethink their practice, their approaches in a way that perhaps some had wished wouldn't come to that point really. So this was the kind of like the peak of the change really, but then the peak of the pandemic reached the UK really in April, and then there was a relaxing of lockdown measures in May, and as you know, now we are again into lockdown in the UK as of this week. So we thought the learning from this would be useful not just for that instance but more broadly for different types of crisis or new waves of crisis. Next slide, please. So we decided to come into dialogue with 3 different organizations in 3 different sectors. So in terms of research, all the research events were conducted online by members of the authorial team. So you'll see my colleagues who are presenting with me today. We obviously received ethical approval from a university. All the online interactions were recorded and transcribed. We didn't want or mean for these data to be representative or generalizable. We just really wanted to learn from the trenches, so to speak. So we wanted to see how leaders in organizations were approaching a crisis. And so we wanted to offer a snapshot and reflections on initial leadership responses to COVID-19 outbreak. So if we look at the 3 organizations, they're all quite different. So they're different in size, they're also different in terms of leadership styles and kind of like hierarchical flexibility. So the first organization is in the private sector. It's a large multinational professional services corporation. And this organization was explored through a one-to-one interview with the senior leader conducted by Christina. The second organization is a university, so a higher education institution. And the data collection was done through a small focus group with 3 of the senior leaders of this institution. The third organization is a network nonprofit organization, and the online focus group was held with 5 colleagues who had different types of leadership and operational leadership roles in the organization. So also in terms of hierarchical style of leadership and flexibility, we also have something that is a continuum. So from the first organization, which is a bit more rigid, to the last organization, which doesn't even think of itself as like a leadership team. They think of themselves as a hosting team. And then in between you have an organization, and in the UK, very often organizations have charity status. So, although obviously there is, you know, budgets, and there are also some private organizations. So the university is kind of like a in the medium section of this continuum. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we were quite keen on investigating was this unprecedented uncertainty that came with change, and change that was experienced at unprecedented levels. So it was changes at the macro socio-political level, changes at the meso organizational institutional level, and changes for individuals. And all these 3 levels of change and, you know, need for experimentation and innovation were experienced at the same time globally, which to us was a phenomenon definitely worth exploring. So we were very aware of the fact that this type of change would normally take years and maybe decades in organizations, and we were now in many cases forced to, you know, become more innovative and more experimental because of this change. And the pace was extremely fast, so things had to be decided, changed, adapted very quickly. And then most of us had to learn with and through new technology. So obviously today we're here on Zoom, and perhaps we would have been seeing each other face to face otherwise. And this has both, you know, challenges and benefits, because many of us perhaps wouldn't have been able to attend otherwise. So we had, you know, video conferencing facilities. We had new programs, new systems, new databases, or databases that were physical, you know, hardware that needed to be migrated. And so there were lots of things that had to be considered. Another key issue for us in organizations was the aspect of working from home. So obviously this speaks to me particularly because my research focuses on equality, or the lack thereof, in organizations. And so we noticed how working from home really highlighted issues of inequality, but also normalized other practices, for example, working from home or working flexibly, that had before been a reason of marginalization. So we noticed how working from home helped some colleagues, but also became an invasion of the personal sphere for others. So we were really interested in thinking about this, and also analyzing how colleagues, you know, were balancing the idea of going back to how things were before, and then an increasing awareness that maybe things like before were never going to be there anymore. And so we had to think of a new normal, or a next normal, or a more flexible way of thinking of normality completely. Next, please. Thank you. So these are the key themes that we will be exploring that came out of our data collection. So our findings will be introduced by my colleagues, and I would like to ask Christina, please, to start with prioritizing what's important. And if we will stop after the first finding, and if colleagues want to type their questions in the chat, we can then look at the questions at the end of the first theme. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilaria. That set the scene really well. What we've got on this slide, just before we move on to talking about prioritizing, which is my contribution, we just have, we identified some themes across all of the interviews and conversations that seem to be particularly strong and particularly shared. So those are the things that we want to concentrate on for the moment. So if we could have the next slide, Ruth. Ruth? Right, thank you. This is the first of our findings, and the one that I'm going to talk about for a few minutes. And as I say, at the end of that, we'd be really interested in hearing your reactions to that and whether that maps onto your experiences or is actually very, very different. And I think as we were preparing for this presentation, one of the things that really struck me, well, I was remembering back to when we were planning this work, and we were saying, we're not reflecting back on how we managed the pandemic because we are still in it. Now, that was in the summer. We didn't realize we were going to be going back into lockdown, which is what we're doing in the UK, as Ilaria has said. We're certainly not at the end of this. What we're looking at the moment, we're really people's instantaneous responses and what is the most important thing to do. And my slide, I think my theme here really epitomizes that, because one thing which I experienced in my organization, and again, I came up in all of the discussions, was the need to prioritize what's important. People were suddenly almost, for some organizations, almost within 24 hours. A few others had a bit more preparatory time, but suddenly people were moving from one way of working to another. And so this sense of what we've called kind of clearing the decks and saying, what do we have to concentrate on? What is the most important thing for our business, for our organization? What do we absolutely have to do? Was really quite, was obviously quite important. It was also in a way quite liberating for those of us on the receiving end, because suddenly a lot of the less urgent priorities, the non-essential paperwork, administrative work, all of that was put aside. It was what really has to happen to make things work. And as I say, this theme was obviously reflected across all three of the conversations. I think it is not a theme that has persisted throughout the crisis. So I'm very glad that we were able to capture this from the early sets of interviews. And certainly one of the themes that came across was how you do that, which is to create a climate and a culture, as much as you can, that is really balancing being very decisive and also giving permission. That on the one hand, leaders had to be seen to be on top of things, even if they weren't necessarily feeling particularly on top of things, but to give the sense that they had this all under control. At the same time, making it clear that people were working at a distance, they were working at home. They also had to be given the permission to get on with things and just do it in whatever way was right for them. The quote that we've got, that we chose to kind of epitomize this particular theme, came from the interview that I did with a senior manager in a quite large corporate organization. And I'm going to read it because I've just realized that on my screen anyway, we've got little pictures of us down the side, and so you probably can't quite see the quotes. But this particular senior manager said, the bigger thing for me was giving people a kind of sense that these are the things that are important at the moment. And she went on to say, the things that were important were protect our people, protect our firm, and the principle would be that the higher earners would be taking more of the pain. And I think that's a very a very impressive message to be conveying to, for that organization, an enormous workforce of people who are all feeling in very different ways quite uncertain and quite traumatized by the situation that we were suddenly finding ourselves in, because there's a kind of confidence that quote demonstrates, that I think probably if I had been on the receiving end would have made me feel a bit more relaxed and a bit calmer and a bit able to cope. My organization did something very similar. Messages started coming out saying, whatever you're doing is good enough. Under circumstances like this, just being there, just keeping going, just keeping things ticking over is absolutely good enough. But I think the excitement of that was this sense of prioritizing what's important. And that has to be the people in the organization and what the organization is there to do. So the purpose of the organization. So I think at that stage, we might just pause and see whether any questions or comments are coming in, whether people would like to respond to that, whether that in any way matches your experience. So what have we got? I've got a message. Ernst is putting a message. Yes, right, about how to see both the slides.
Sorry, not on content, but still allowing people to see the whole slide, so you can adjust that. But I do have a question also, if I may.
Yes.
I don't know if it's too early already in the presentation, but I have some difficulties with the term of new normal. I know it's incredibly common, everyone uses it, everyone talks about the new normal, but for me, normal has, on one side, it is probably things that we are just simply used to, and in that sense, we are getting used to things. At the same time, to me, it is also something where, you know, that is desirable, or that is a state where I say this is all right, it should be like this, for me to call it normal. And so in that sense, I mean, should we talk about a new normal in a situation where, you know, we experience substantial limitations to our mobility, to freedoms, where we are having, you know, the welfare state reaching its limits of what it can provide, where we have so many restrictions and adversities, that I have great difficulties talking about the new normal. What is your take, and what was your interviews partner's take on this terminology of talking about a new normal, about something that really shouldn't feel like normal, and it doesn't to me.
No. I've just noticed Ilaria's put a note in the chat box to say she absolutely agrees, and maybe she'll come in on that as well. It's interesting how time is how we're experiencing time at the moment, because I did the first of these interviews, or the first conversations, in early July, and already that feels like years ago. So I mean, so much is happening at such a condensed pace, and so I think at that stage we were talking with with our respondents about how they had responded to events of just a couple of months or so before then. So what this might settle down to, what life will be like after the crisis and the pandemic, was almost not anything that people were concentrating on in the discussions. They were really much more about how did we respond to this totally unprecedented situation, the kind of situation that has never occurred in the kind of societies that we're living in at the moment. So I think that phrase didn't come up so much in the interviews. I think it's becoming more of a cliche that we're using now, and I think we are falling into it. And I think you're absolutely right, Ernst, that we need to think about what we mean by that and what we don't want to mean by that. I'm just having a look at I hope everyone else is looking in the comments box as well. It's problematic. It is to be problematized. It was used for convenience in the sense that things would pass. Well, they haven't, of course. So here we are in a much more unprecedented situation. There's another question coming in the level of clearing the decks, which is obviously one of the very important points in my particular finding. How inclusive and collaborative was the decision-making process was, and how much will be taken forward. I realize it might be too early for this. Well, a couple of quick responses to that, and one is that the ways in which decisions were being made is one of the themes that we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes. So I think we might return to that. In terms of what's going to be taken forward, I think that's the big question. And one of the reasons why we really wanted to write this chapter was to capture things that were already being lost. Alongside all the traumas, there were some rather wonderful things that happened in the first few weeks of lockdown. Particularly the sense of appreciating people who are often unappreciated. You know, suddenly the people who were stacking shelves in grocery stores were keeping us fed, and the dustbin people were making sure the streets were clean and there weren't rats running around, and things that we utterly take for granted. The sense that the really important workers, you know, the high value workers, terrible phrase, were the people who generally get paid the least, get thought about the least, get taken for granted the most, and yet we're keeping civilization going in many ways. And that sense of appreciation, I think, is something that it would be a terrible shame if we lost that. So I think we already are losing a great deal of the really exciting insights that happened in those early stages, which, as I say, was why we wanted to try and capture some of that before it just disappeared out of people's memory and gets overlaid by new experiences. Would anyone else like to make a comment or a question before we move on to the next finding? I don't think I'm seeing anything else in the chat box. We will come back, as I say, to this question about collaborative decision making. Okay, in that case, I think I'll hand over to Ruth, who has the next of our findings to present.
Yes, very important to unmute. I do hope everyone can hear me okay.
Yes.
Good. I'm very relieved about that. I'm going to share with you some of the findings we had about the elements of building trust. Now, we like to think in societies that we do trust other people, but the fact that in the crisis that we were in, this featured as an element says rather something about maybe how we have been conducting ourselves before. Early this morning, I was privileged to get up very early and see Professor Roger Ames's session, The Chinese Contribution on Confucianism. And one of the things he talked about was the quality of relationships in society. And it spoke to me very strongly about the kind of things that had emerged in our early research. And the fact was that trust, building trust, or maybe even rebuilding trust, was very important. But this was a two-way dynamic, and it was very strongly linked to good communications, crafting clear messages. So all the leaders that we spoke to in our organizations talked about building two-way trust dynamics between the organization and its employees. And as I said, you cannot build trust if you're hiding something. And so clear communication was absolutely fundamental to this. And working collaboratively with people as well. Another feature was about trying to instill a sense of calm and order through those leaders the behavior of those leaders, something that they felt a great obligation to do, even though they may not have felt very calm under the circumstances. It was important to acknowledge to oneself and to perhaps to select others that it was very difficult to feel calm and collected all the time. And playing a leadership role in the heat of a crisis generally felt very different to these leaders, especially when it actually meant exposing oneself, one's persona, and sometimes one's physical, well, quite often one's physical environment, i.e. the home, where home and work increasingly became blurred. The boundaries were blurred. Our leaders that we spoke to didn't use the term humanistic management, and we tried not to use it too much in our conversations with them. But there were some very strong and implicit resonances with the ideas of building dignity, maintaining dignity, and valuing. And therefore, there was a common view amongst our participants that the focusing on values and people had created a sense of pride and order and purpose in the crisis that we had. One participant actually said that through the leadership handling the crisis and dealing with it the way that they were doing, the organization was doing, talked about the pride in the organization increasing, because all of a sudden, through clear communications and trusting, they had a much clearer line of sight to the purpose of the organization. We were told very strongly across the three research interventions that we did, that we had to have very, very high levels of trust to deal with what we're going to ask them to do. What that was largely be a worker, but be a worker at home, and to acknowledge the fact that their home life is blur, and their personal and their work life intersect. So we had to trust them to and to convey trust that we understood that they would be perhaps working from their kitchen table, that they would have cats and dogs roaming around their offices, and also there will be children at home as well, especially in the early part of the lockdown, where many workers had children at home, and they were also expected to homeschool them. So it was clear that trust wasn't just one way, it was very much two ways. Leaders had to make sure also that they had the trust of their own colleagues. And one of the senior leaders that we spoke to said that she made sense of her leadership role in this way. She said, there are two slightly different trust equations. Me trusting you might have built more trust in me, but mine as the leader is much more of an active, a conscious need for trust. It's not that trust me, I'm a priest, or trust me, I'm a whatever, a senior leader, but it's the little actions that all add up into making sure our people felt that they were trusted. Particularly in the third organisation we approached, the non-profit organisation that Ilaria described as not having a leadership team as such, but not calling themselves a hosting team. The theme of trust was very much talked about in that organisation. And he said, you need to be in a position where you're with people that you trust when the crisis hits. I guess you need to be with people you trust to be uncomfortable with uncertainty, to be comfortable with uncertainty. Then he added, not comfortable as such, but willing at least to acknowledge it. And at the end of the discussion, another participant in that organization took up the notion of trust and said that it was goodwill and good intention that go a long way to creating trust. And the quotation here that you see on the right of the screen was, let's get through this together rather than fight or polarize. So I go back to what I said earlier, the idea of good relationships and valuing one another goes a long way to building trust, to getting things done within the organization, wherever that organization is, and wherever the people are, that there is this trust dynamic, and there is honesty and good intention and goodwill. And so I think with that, I think we're going to move on straight away to the next finding that we had. So I'm going to turn the slide because I'm driving that as well.
Hey, Ruth, I think we've got some time for questions on building trust if people want. And if I may abuse my privilege as co-presenter.
Of course you may.
One of the things that I think was also important in our conversations with leaders was the fact that sometimes this need for building trust also meant, rethinking leadership styles. So, things that are not particularly useful necessarily in terms of, leading others, like presentism or very rigid mechanisms of control and monitoring. These had to be put aside and be, in favor of more empowering ways of leading. And also there was a point where colleagues had, initially in a crisis, it's normal to think about self-preservation and personal interests. Like, for example, is my job safe and secure? And, but actually through building trust and relationships, people also started shifting towards collective interest. So, not just a humanistic perspective on an individual to individual basis or leader to workforce basis, but also across the workforce, where people, for example, started thinking, maybe we can all take a small pay cut so that we can preserve everybody's salary, or how are other colleagues going to do it? How can we be flexible? And one of the questions before talked about differences, and working from home definitely highlighted these differences, but also the fact that we need more personalized approaches to how we work and how we lead. And I think working from home magnified social dynamics, kind of privilege, accessibility, and other personal circumstances that we wouldn't have seen as explicitly, perhaps.
I think that's so true. And I go back again to finding so much that Professor Ames spoke about this morning about relationships, and a key tenet of the inseparability of the one and the many, to remind us that we are in the world. And I think we are in the world and with others. And I think this idea, it may be that we've forgotten about the importance of the relationship, and the fundamental building block of that is trusting. And I think initially our participants talked about trust in that way, as if it had never existed before. I'm sure it had, but it had been very highlighted during this particular crisis. And for me, the big takeaway, or one of the big takeaways, is thinking about how we trust and maintain that trust, and maintain and make relationships even better. And remember that we are part of community. and not just an individual. We are an individual in the world, and for me, that is a very big part of learning from what we did and what we have all experienced.
There's a there's a wonderful quote, a comment that has just come in from Jafar. He says, "What I'm hearing is that a kind of systemic alignment of vulnerabilities emerged." I love that phrase. I absolutely love that. Or was created between individual, team, organization, wider society, wider world. I think systemic alignment of vulnerabilities, that is a phrase I'm going to ponder on. I think that's absolutely delightful. And yes, I think that does seem absolutely what people were saying. Does anybody else want to react to that?
My personal feeling is that there was definitely systemic awareness where before there might have been systemic ignorance or silencing. So I'm not sure if there was alignment, but I think things definitely came to the open and were approached in different ways. I think, personal needs, access to, different types of technology due to disability or other needs, access to rooms where you can work in, and I think the fact that the pandemic seems to have affected some groups of people more than others, but also really highlighted that, going back to what Ernst said before, there is no normal. Normal really doesn't exist because we're all in a slightly different circumstance. And so I think now this has become more evident, more explicit, and perhaps more, maybe not welcome, but definitely more tolerated and more negotiated and managed within organizations, I would say.
Oh, there's
Yes,
another. Sorry.
Sorry.
Just saying, there's another comment coming through. We are relearning many aspects of human cooperation in and out of the work arena. Yes, I think that's right.
I do think that's true. I think we have to capitalize on this, though, for the future. We can't go back. I hope we don't go back to the completely individualistic approaches that I suspect we had, this hyper competitivity that we had in some societies prior to the pandemic. It's rather shaming that we're having to praise the fact that we're actually talking about these human values now, which is quite interesting. And I think also, just going back to the systemic vulnerabilities being exposed, I think where you are sitting in your kitchen, perhaps wearing a smart shirt and tie, but actually you've got your denims or your joggers on underneath the table. It kind of does expose the fact that we are actually all human, and within our home, that is exactly where we are most human, and we must forget that. We mustn't forget that.
Some more interesting comments.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, Ken's comment about our organizations learning that they're more loosely coupled than they thought. And I think a comment from Ernst, organizations have a trust focus previously are doing better now, or do you see those who didn't reflect already, or are they just in firefighting mode? I think we should probably move on in a moment, but I just want to respond to that one, because I think that different organizations are taking this learning away differently. And although in my organization, which is a university, not the one that was part of the study, it was very noticeable that at the beginning, trust was very high. there was a very real sense of we have to trust people. We can't control them. They're at home. You know, we have to trust them to understand what's important and to get on with it. As the months have gone by, that's been replaced by a huge, monumental increase in a kind of bureaucracy which is trying to standardize everything so that some control can be reimposed, so that the sense that we could be trusted to get on with teaching in the best way that we could online is being replaced by a need to have very standardized approaches so that everything can be demonstrated to be of top quality, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that some organizations have already lost some of these very important elements from the early days. There are lots of comments coming in, but Ilaria, you're quietly managing the time boundaries in the back. Do we have time for more discussion, or should we move on?
Yes, I think we can take a couple of more if you're happy with that.
It's a very interesting one.
Yes, it's Maria's comment. The conflicts and challenges that leaders, HE are prioritizing financial sustainability.
Yes.
That's a very, I mean, those of you who are not in the UK may not know that there's a big issue at the moment about students being encouraged to go back at the start of the semester in September, October, and then immediately, of course, contracting the virus because lots of people in a very small space, being confined in tiny university residence rooms. This has not happened in every university at all. Some universities have very, very low infection rates, but there have been some very, very highly publicized situations which are just terrible. And, you know, the situation for students must be ghastly. And so this question about whether higher education institutions moved back to face-to-face teaching too quickly or not, and whether there was a financial imperative behind that is a tricky one, because of course there is a financial imperative, without doubt. At the same time, most students enjoy learning face-to-face more than they enjoy learning online, and most of us enjoy teaching face-to-face more than we do online. So my personal feeling on this question about whether universities were sort of pressurized into having students back too quickly is that it is complicated, because there are very good reasons for trying to get back to face-to-face teaching as soon as possible. It does turn out to have been a little bit too quick, but it didn't necessarily feel like that in the summer. So yes, the wonderful marketization of higher education is an issue we could talk about forever, but maybe have to move on from a bit.
I think Ernst has picked up something that, you know, when we originally did the research, we were very excited by what we were seeing around us, the kindness, the trust, and all those kind of things in the early days. And Ernst is quite rightly pointing out that it wasn't the trust that what we saw could have been a giving into reality, yes, purely to cope with the situation. And as time has got on, I feel that there is an element of truth in that, most definitely. But by highlighting it, I think that it is a possibility. It has potential. I think maybe being optimistic, we may be able to highlight this as a way forward. I don't know. I would like to hope so. I really would.
Yes. Shall we move on to the next section and then have a bit of a break after that?
Yes, let's do that. Thank you.
Right, communicating and consulting. I'm aware, by the way, that as we're picking up themes in conversation, there's a lot of cross-fertilization. These themes we're presenting are not neatly compartmentalized. They are, without a doubt, kind of feeding into each other. But Jafar, I think you were asking earlier about communicating and consulting. and I paused you for a bit because I said we would come back to that theme, because that was, of course, a very strong theme, because the channels for communication were fewer and therefore became much more important. So there's obviously Zoom, the joys of Zoom, Zoom and its compadres, as I often refer to them, Teams, etc. And also email. So there was, face-to-face, but mediated through Zoom, and email, words mediated through email, and that was really pretty much it. And the impression that we got quite strongly from the leaders that we interviewed was a real balancing act here, because there was a need to be honest with people, and also a need to show awareness of the anxieties that people were feeling. And so the one person was saying we actually had to be honest about the fact that this could be an existential crisis. We might not survive this. And of course, that's not really the message that people want to hear when they've just been told to go home and there's a virus running around which is going to, have a very, very, very significant death rate. The last thing you want to know is that actually your job might be about to go as well. But at the same time saying we have to be honest with people. So we have to somehow find ways of communicating where we are really demonstrating our understanding of what people are experiencing at home, but also being honest with them about what the situation really, really is. And so that did lead, at least in the early days, to, for many organizations, a more consultative way of approaching how they did actually communicate some of those key messages. And the need to be consulting with a much wider range of stakeholders about what some of those messages might be. Certainly in my organization, I was aware that in the early days, there was a kind of, there was a very impressive caring about people that appeared in people's messages in a way that hadn't been before. So when people said, how are you? They really meant it. You could tell it wasn't just a, oh, how are you? It was a really, how are you? Because we recognized that people might not be all right. And a lot of much more frequent messaging, much more frequent appearances online of people in senior positions, making sure that people knew that they were there, that they were listening, that they were appreciating what was going on. And I think also, as this particular quote demonstrates, more of an awareness of the importance of making sure that you are crafting your messages, that you really only got these much more limited range of media for getting messages across. If you send out an ill-advised or an ill-thought-through message, the consequences can be much greater than they might have been when we were all working in the same office. You could pop down the corridor to say, sorry, I didn't quite mean what I said in the email. So suddenly the world has changed quite dramatically in that sense. So obviously, for example, this particular leader was saying, I think we've really changed the way we approached getting messages out. There's much more of a collaborative approach in crafting the email or the blog post, where we can all contribute for a few hours before it's sent out, have a think about it, make sure it really is the kind of message that people want to get across. So this sense, we talk about a lot about balancing in humanistic management, balancing different needs and priorities and juggling with them, and this sense of how to be reassuring, how to recognize people's very high levels of anxiety, but also really being honest about the scale of the situation that people were actually facing and continue to face as time goes on. I'm just going to see what's going on in the chat box. Yes, and as Bob has said, the counterintuitive realization that messages take time to craft. that it may be, your instinct may be to rush out a message quickly, but that may be the wrong instinct, and it may be necessary to think that through a bit more carefully. Does that sort of resonate with other people's experiences?
If I may, I think something that was also interesting was, and someone referred to that before, as firefighting, because as we were firefighting, I think, as you say, there was this fast pace of communication, and I think that also created quite a lot of emotional labor and cognitive labor, or always expecting a new email, a new expectation, a new requirement, a new change of policy or practice or processes. So I think, having this more shared approach to communication, and as Bob was saying, taking the time to pause, because sometimes during the day, it felt like it'd been days instead of 3 hours, because there had been so many changes within a day. So that was also interesting. Jaffa has a point. Yes, I think it was more adult to adult rather than adult to child type of relationship and dialogue. I think you're absolutely right there.
But I'm not sure that has been maintained. So Temitope, true for you as well. Yes, it takes time to draft a meaningful message. It does, and I think even in such a crisis when things were moving so quickly, that recognition was important. Yeah. Ilaria, in your role as your quiet role in providing the structure for this, those are 3 of the 5 findings. We thought we might take a brief break at this stage, didn't we? And it is actually 11 o'clock, so that's slightly more. It sounds like we timed that perfectly. It's not quite as simple as that, but we'll pretend it is.
Yes, I think it would be great to have just a 5-minute break to stretch our legs, have a comfort break, grab a cup of tea or glass of water or coffee, whatever you might like, and so we can reconvene at 6 minutes past 11, if that's okay.
Great.
I have just added to the chat that we're taking a small break for colleagues who've just joined us, and we are now returning to the session. So if you can make your way back to the session. As we reconnect, I think there are a couple of really interesting points in the chat, looking at how some groups have been kind of like marginalized in decision-making processes, and or how some groups have not been, well, they've been caught in between, as Rebecca says, which is absolutely right. And that's the case for international students, for example, in higher education, but also different types or groups of people in other types of organizations. And I think that's definitely important to acknowledge. And this is very linked to our next finding. So one of the ways of making sure that decision making is not just done with the interest of the biggest part of a population or most privileged part of a population of an organization in mind, I think one of the ways to go about this is to consider shared leadership and shared decision making. I'm not sure if Christina and Ruth are back. I can see Christina.
I am.
Ruth, I was just saying how our next theme emerging from our conversations with leaders really chimes in with some of the points that were made in the chat about decision making that is not inclusive or marginalizes or leaves people caught in between.
Mm.
So Ruth, do you want to talk us through the next point?
Indeed. Okay. So want to start by looking at the quotation that's on the right-hand side of the screen. One of our participants said that leadership is not one person at the top, it's through every level. And making all of our leaders feel like they were empowered to talk to their people with confidence about what we were doing was a very, very important component for me of what we needed to achieve. If you ask our team, they would say it felt co-created. And I would say it feels like it was co-created, but with a heavy splash of influence from me. Those of us who've looked at and perhaps taught leadership and management in our business schools will know about the different form of leadership styles and things like shared or distributed leadership. And very much we found that our leadership participants or leader participants were very much engaging with their staff, and they were not hero position leaders. We also, so we found that leadership was being diffused across levels and teams, and that they were working together and co-creating. The other thing that we found was that there was an acceptance of not knowing, and we had to develop a tolerance of ambiguity in those early days. So although the organizations we approached for this are very, very different in their types of leadership and their hierarchical structures, ranging from very hierarchical through to very networked operations, during the early stages of the pandemic, it became clear to all those leaders that in those circumstances, it would need to be leadership, getting things done would need to be addressed through delegation of authority and a more shared sense of leadership. One participant observed that their most senior colleague, again echoing Mintzberg, would say this was engaging leadership rather than heroic leadership. And he soon realized that the situation was not supportive of people taking everything on their own shoulders, but things had to be diffused and delegated to an appropriate level of authority, and to delegating and trusting the support team around him to take responsibility for many of those initiatives. I think, and for some leaders more used to sort of a structured hierarchical leadership approach, it must have felt quite difficult, that realization that he or she could not take everything on themselves. They had to delegate. So sometimes in leadership roles, position leadership roles, there is this tendency to hold on and think that only I can do it. And others around people, those position leaders, began to realize that no, this leader could not do everything by him or herself. So there was very much this sense of diffused leadership and ownership of the issues, of problems, of decisions that went across all teams and levels. In the non-profit organisation, the third organisation that we looked at, where the leadership team didn't call themselves a leadership team, but a hosting team, they instinctively saw their collective roles as leading with shared responsibility. And one of them offered a summary of leadership as being everyone seeing that things go well and that no one is a victim. Even in the private sector organizations that perhaps have more traditional leadership structures, the importance of working together and was significant. Another strand that came across was, of course, this the idea that we were in that overused term, unprecedented times, where we didn't know from one day to the next, and it was okay to not know. But with a strong group of people around you, our leaders felt supported in their not knowing. So working together to provide solutions proved to be very important and significant in achieving positive outcomes for the organisation. And this is a quotation that you may see later on in the slide, but I think it's most apt. One of the senior leaders in the university that we talked to had a very interesting metaphor, and that was, we've been taking off. Then they went on to say, my take is that it's even worse than that, because if you're building a plane, you tend to have some complex blueprint, some technical instruction manual about which bits go where. And we didn't have that because we didn't know what was around the corner, and no one had built something like this before. So this idea of not knowing, this ambiguity, where people had to learn to tolerate that. And the way they did that was through sharing responsibility and distributing that, and diffusing the authority across the organization. So learning to tolerate, not necessarily be wholly comfortable with it, but learning to tolerate ambiguity was recurrent throughout our three organizations. And with support from a range of people, range of sources inside the organization, it became possible to manage their own anxieties and the health and safety of others and their concerns of others as well. Ambiguity isn't something people are always comfortable with, but you can still manage and get things done even when the situation is very uncertain. So that's I think the third or fourth finding that we had, this importance of the reality of something that we see in textbooks about shared and distributed leadership actually being played out in our three case study organizations. So Ilaria, I don't know if there are any questions, comments, observations that you can see.
Yes, there is an observation from Peter saying this, the acceptance of not knowing, asking for help, supporting students and staff online learning and interaction seems to be one of the leadership valued qualities from their experience in the present pandemic time. And I think that's definitely also something that in the university focus group was raised, that, you know, it's okay as a leader, especially now, to say, I'm not sure what's going to happen. I don't know. I feel anxious about this as well. Let's work together on trying to find solutions. And I think this was something that perhaps some of the leaders had not explored as an approach or an attitude to communication and working with others as well.
And I think certainly, you know, when students come to a business school to learn about management and leadership, there is always this sense that I must know, I must have the answer, and only I can do it. But our experiences have indicated that people are beginning to realize that that isn't the case. You know, we are inseparable from others around us. We are inseparable from the situation in which we find ourselves in, and it's working together and sharing by which we can get things done. So yes, I think it's a really quite a big takeaway, and something I think that, you know, we should be thinking much more strongly about in our curricula for would-be managers and leaders and professionals in organizations.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions on this, so perhaps we can move on to the next theme.
Yeah, just one second.
Thank you, Christina. Floor is yours.
It is. It will be as soon as Ruth.
It will, yes. Sorry, I have to find the little buttons at the bottom to move things on.
Thank you. This is the final finding that we're going to talk about, and then Bob is going to come in with some wider reflections about what we found out and also about the process. And I was really glad to present this one because I think it's one that really interests me enormously, about the blurring of personal and professional boundaries. We have talked about this before because it has come in to our discussion about some of the other findings as well. I think many of us were sort of brought up on this idea that you separate your work life from the rest of your life. You have your work persona epitomized by whatever you're wearing from the waist up, and you've got your home persona, suit trousers that are waist down, and you keep those things separately because keeping those separate boundaries is how you maintain the pressures, the anxieties, the stresses, and also I suppose the need to see yourself as being not exactly objective. That's not a word I would think is quite appropriate, but that your work persona is not distracted by irrelevant considerations. And that is how you manage the interface between the tensions and pressures that you experience in both sides of your lives. And of course, having to work from home completely challenges all of that. People who've been working from home for a very long time will have developed ways of managing this. But for many of us who are really thrown into full-time work from home, that neat separation became completely difficult to maintain. And of course, when we were talking with each other, you'd suddenly see that your work colleagues' children were kind of clambering onto their laps, or the cats and dogs that kind of walk across the screen, and everything goes a bit wonky. And I think I'm sure we've all had the experience of kind of sneaking a look behind the person and saying, what kind of decorations do they have on the walls? What kind of taste do they have? Where do they live? And these kind of insights into other people's lives, which you've used these phrases, new intimacies, were quite interesting because they really do challenge our idea about how we present ourselves at work. And we, of course, we couldn't just ignore those particularly during the first phases of lockdown, because we always had to be aware that everybody was working in very different circumstances. So as we were saying before, some people would be homeschooling, some people would be sharing the only computer in the house with the other person, with other partners or flatmates who might also be working from home, with the kids wanting to do their online schooling plans or whatever. And you couldn't ignore all of these issues because they absolutely had an impact on how people were able to do the job. And just a slight aside, when I did the first interview with the senior manager, I found myself, it was the first time I'd done an interview with Zoom online. And I found the whole experience quite disconcerting because in the one sense, you think if you're at a distance, because of course we're all in our individual spaces, we're not seeing each other, we're not in each other's spaces, and yet there's a very odd kind of intimacy by only seeing someone's face. You've got this huge face and nothing else. Every little twitch that somebody makes in their face, you see. So there's a kind of extraordinary exposure at the same time as you're working through a medium, which in theory is very distancing. So how we manage these new experiences of intimacy and distance and personal and professional boundaries, I think is very interesting. And clearly the quote that we've used here talks again about the need to be acknowledging that people's home lives matter. You can't separate the person from the job when they're working from home with the kids and the cats crawling over their laps. You just simply can't make those separations, which in the past we've kidded ourselves we could do. We could just relate to people as work in their work roles when we see them at work, and anything else is entirely separate and private and not relevant to the work situation. And all of that has gotten really quite dramatically shaken up. And I think what's interesting about this, many things are interesting about this, but one is that there are both advantages and risks. And the person who made this comment was saying, I think we've become much more human. We're much more aware of ourselves as holistic beings. And even when we're talking to people about a work issue, we are relating to them in a more holistic way than we would have before. And we've realized we can do that, and it doesn't damage the work relationship by acknowledging that people have kids crawling over their laps while they're in the middle of a very important high-level meeting. They can actually still do that. We can do that. The cat can knock the computer off and we still carry on. And I think perhaps we would have thought beforehand we couldn't, that those things have to be kept out. They will intrude in work. We have to keep these things out of these more private aspects of our being. We have to keep out of our work relationships. So in some ways, that much more holistic, much more intimate way of working seems very, very exciting and very positive, because we've discovered we can do it, and we didn't know before that we could. At the same time, it does raise this question around protection, because managing those boundaries was, in the past, one of the ways we protected ourselves from stress and burnout. The sense that we could close the door or close the office or come back home and put our work roles out of our minds, at least for a few hours, concentrate on the kids, the family, the dog, whatever. And now those boundaries don't exist. They could be anywhere. You know, we always were answering emails at midnight, but it seems even more acute at the moment. And so, although we didn't include this quote in the presentation, the senior manager that I interviewed did say that she felt it was a leadership responsibility to help people recreate those boundaries for themselves in ways that will make their lives more manageable. And I don't think we yet know how to do that or where to do it. But this need to be balancing, on the one hand, the greater awareness of people as holistic beings, and on the other hand, the need for us all to be able to turn off, stop, occasionally say no, not answer the emails, just chill out and have a separate life for a little bit of time, is very important. I think many of us, those of us who are in work, which is of course not everyone, those of us who are in work at the moment seem to be experiencing increased workloads beyond what we could ever have imagined. People who are not in work are, of course, some people are very happy to be not in work. Others are desperate because the unemployment rate is going up like nobody's business. And people's very obvious need for work and livelihood is incredibly important and a source of tremendous anxiety. So that's another balance we haven't managed to get right. I think we haven't quite yet worked out how to manage these boundaries in a new sort of way. And I think that's an interesting and a challenging way forward. Shall we move on at that stage to Bob, and who's going to sum up with some kind of overall reflections, and then we'll have some more space for comments after that?
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Bob, over to you.
Well, thank you. Now, first of all, I something funny has happened, and I don't know. Can you see me all right? Because I can't see any of you.
Oh dear.
Yes,
can you hear me? Yes.
You can hear me. I don't have access to chat, I'm afraid, at the moment. So somebody may have to sort of monitor that, if you would do that. Well, we call this bit of the presentation other insights and reflections, learning in and through crisis. And in a way, the whole project that we've been involved in researching the material for this book chapter has been a learning experience, not just for the leaders that we contacted, but for us as a research and authorial team as well. And what I propose to do here is maybe to elaborate a little more on some of the themes that have already been touched upon. Not to repeat them, but maybe to highlight some of the learning aspects that we identified within them. And if you can see the slide, what we've tried to do is to divide this bit of the presentation into three broad areas. One focusing on the leaders' learning, one focusing on the researchers' learning, that is our learning, and then some sort of general observations about the learning opportunities that have been presented by leading in a crisis. Surprising though that may seem, it has been a fertile ground for learning about leading and learning about doing new things as well. So if we begin with the participants' perspectives, that is the leaders themselves, I think one of the very obvious things, now I was particularly involved in facilitating the focus group with the university in question, which by the way was not the University of Chichester, it was another university. And it was very clear, and I think this has already come out in some of the examples that have been touched upon, that leaders were asking themselves very searching questions about their own practice and about, in effect, were they helping or hindering in their behaviors in responding to the crisis, particularly in the early moments. And the opportunity that emerged when we invited them to participate in a focus group was actually very welcome, because it was an opportunity for that group of leaders to take stock and to reflect in a safe space, if you like, in a facilitated space, which in a crisis, which is full on, and everybody, after the initial Indian summer, where things for the first 2 weeks appeared to be quite quiet and not much seemed to be happening, suddenly became highly stressful, with lots of things being requiring their attention. To find or to create a space where through the questions that we invited them to consider was helpful to them in making sense of what they were doing and what they might do subsequently as well. So the research project we were engaged in, for them, I think in all cases, was welcomed as an opportunity for reflective sense making and a chance to see that they could respond to situations in the moment and learn while they were doing that. So that's one general point. I think being interviewed was a rare space and one where it was a chance to take stock. We've already mentioned the recognition that initially there was a temptation to engage in what Mintzberg would call heroic leadership, and that actually being the flag carrier and taking swift action, taking all the responsibility upon the shoulders often of the most senior leader was unsustainable. And there was a recognition that over time, actually quite quickly, the leadership decision-making needed to be shared and distributed, and that's where the element of trust became paramount. And Mintzberg talks about engaging leadership, which is an interesting idea, and certainly in the context of that particular university, and I think it applied to others as well. So I think there was a shift. I don't know, for example, if Boris Johnson at the moment is engaging in heroic leadership or engaging leadership, but that same continuum or spectrum is something that's worth observing. Because heroic leadership is actually very stressful upon the leader who decides to act in that way. And it can also be very blocking for others who are willing to, to take responsibilities. In the reflections of the leaders, there was a recognition that this doesn't just apply in an acute crisis, that resistance needed to be overcome. Or at least dealt with. And of course, engagement with trades union in particular was a particular concern, where those carefully crafted messages that we mentioned earlier played a significant role in engaging with unions, who obviously were very concerned about the health and safety and economic survival of their members. So resistance and co-creating new practice was something that the learning contributed to, I would say. The self-questioning of the leaders was very striking, and it was very humbling across all three cases, I think, that we were engaged in. Being prepared at least to be vulnerable to the researchers and also to other stakeholders as well, in as much as that helped them to earn the trust whilst making the kind of decisions, some difficult ones that were necessary. So am I helping or hindering in my leadership role was an implicit question which was made explicit in the course of the conversations. I don't know if, perhaps shall I carry on and then have the questions? Hello?
Hello?
Yes, up to you. We don't have any questions on the chat yet. So if you want to carry on, and then we'll take questions either on this section or the previous ones, whatever participants might want.
Because the two other areas that I just wanted to touch upon were the learning that we and the insights that we as researchers derived from participating in this project, and then some very brief general other insights as well. And I think it's very interesting how we worked together as a team, and a self-managing team, which in many ways seemed to reflect how the leaders in the three organizations that we were engaged with seemed to operate as well, even although they were in predetermined leadership structures. The importance of engaging with each other and in acknowledging the diversity of skills and perspectives that we brought to a shared task. And we certainly in my opinion, my colleagues may want to comment on this, I think we very quickly gelled as a team, and we devoted a considerable amount of time on the emotional labor of crafting both our investigation and our writing up process, and indeed in preparing for this presentation as well. And that maybe exemplifies the comment that was made earlier about taking time to to communicate and come to decisions, even if there was a certain urgency in doing that. I think we've also commented on the impact of the technology, and in our case, learning about conducting fieldwork in cyberspace, because that has its challenges. It has obviously its benefits as well, from the very simple challenge of what if the technology goes wrong, and overcoming that through improvisation. And it seems in some ways to mirror the way that the leaders we were engaging with improvised when they faced unexpected challenges. There was some initial de-skilling and risk-taking, and again, I suspect that that's inherent in the experience of the leaders we were working with. Learning how to engage with the emerging practice of conducting remote interviews. Will the technology work? Will we let down our colleagues if when we're with the leaders, we are incompetent, if you like? And I'm glad to say that that didn't happen. But I think it was important to acknowledge that we had apprehensions about how it would all work out. And having gone through that set of apprehensions, there's a sense of satisfaction as well, that we got to this point, in the same way that the leaders that we were working with arrived at a sense of satisfaction of getting to the point that they are at now, even if obviously the project is not yet complete. So as far as we as researchers are concerned, we set ourselves the task of harvesting and curating leaders' stories. And storytelling is an important part of making sense of what's going on. Everybody's story matters, of course. And the improvising that we did as an online research team, and which leaders are doing as well. Not exactly learning on the hoof, making it up as you go along, but certainly improvising to emergent issues that arise. And the final general point in terms of other reflections that was very clear is that the pandemic exposed systemic inequities. And I was delighted when Jaffa introduced that phrase, systemic alignment of vulnerabilities, because it seems to kind of map across this notion of systemic inequities. Some people are more privileged than others and are less affected by crisis and this pandemic than others. And you know, there are many obvious examples of, as far as the COVID crisis is concerned, certain demographic groups are more vulnerable to the illness, the virus itself. In any case, Black people, frontline workers, and women carry inequitable, broadly speaking, domestic responsibilities, as well as carrying on their job working from home. We all have different contexts, and I think we've already recognized in this discussion that there are, we can't make assumptions that everybody is affected in exactly the same way. Which, coming back to the broad theme of this conference, leads us to suggest that the crisis, in some ways, is a laboratory for learning and development, both on action and in action, and is an opportunity to demonstrate the value of humanistic management approaches to business and stakeholder needs. it's not a Pollyanna approach. There are some tough decisions that clearly need to be made, as we can see with the way that political leaders are trying to take hold of and manage the pandemic at the moment. But I thought it would be interesting to conclude this part of the presentation by drawing upon a remark that was made by an ancient Roman poet called Juvenal. You're probably very familiar with this quote, quis custodiet ipsos custodes, which broadly means who will watch over the watchers themselves. And if you were to substitute leaders for watchers, who takes care of the leaders? And it's clear that there are two sources of care absolutely essential to manage in this crisis. Leaders need to look after themselves, and leaders also need other people to support them and to work with them. And maybe that's a question for a humanistic management approach, which acknowledges reciprocity and interchangeability, where people look out for each other, which again is a theme that seems to have come out in the discussion so far. We have held out the possibility that we might return, say in 6 months' time, to have another set of conversations with the leaders in question in this particular project. And it will be interesting to see what emerges if we're able to do that. But I think I'll stop there and really over to you, Ilaria.
Thank you, Bob, and everyone. I don't see any new questions on the chat, but if colleagues have any comments or questions or any points that particularly resonate with their context or organizational experience, this is the link to the AMED website that's also in the chat early on, where we're hoping to post some of the questions that we couldn't answer earlier on, or comments to continue the conversation if participants wish to do so. There was a point earlier made by Ken looking at virtual backgrounds that obviously clearly speaks to me. As you can see, this is a picture of a marble wall tile inside the Vatican Museum in Rome, and I started using it some time ago because I felt quite self-conscious about the environment around me. And I have to say, I'm speaking to you from my bed, which is a first. I've never presented at a conference from anything remotely as intimate. But there is someone else working in the house as using the desk. And as we said, we have different circumstances, and so I think it's really interesting also as educators, for example, considering colleagues or students and the use of cameras, of video cameras or images online, and how those affect the way we relate to each other, the rapport we are able to establish with each other, for example. I see that there are some points about sharing backgrounds, and also I might choose to not share a background or go to another part of the house depending on the level of familiarity of the colleague I'm talking to, whether it's an external colleague, someone I know, someone I have an effective relationship with in terms of a friendly colleague, or someone I know well, someone I've known for a long time. So I don't know if anyone has any reflections on Bob's conclusions and lesson learned. Are there any other lessons learned that we could consider that we haven't discussed, perhaps? in the experience of our participants today?
I think, Ilaria and team and conference, that ours, as we have said on several occasions, is merely a snapshot of what was taking place, or what we saw was taking place in a particular place, you know, in the United Kingdom. There are lots of good things that have come out of it. Some of things that perhaps we ought as human beings to have known before and have forgotten. So for me, is how we move this forward. And I think it would be lovely if we could meet our participants again in, say, 6 months' time, because I suspect for sure we'll still be in some form of pandemic situation, albeit perhaps pleased that it's dissipating by then. But how do we move, you know, this recognition of us as human beings with personal lives as well as professional lives, with needs and desires and things to contribute? How do we move that on within organization, within management and leadership? That I don't expect an answer. It's a rhetorical question I would like people to consider as we move forward and as we close our session.
Yes, I think one of the things that I've been reflecting on recently is that, of course, I think I said before, one of the reasons we wanted to do this project was this sense that there were some, along with all the horrors, there were some wonderful things that were happening that we didn't want to lose. And I think we're all also aware that some of those are being lost, and lost quite quickly. So speaking out about those things that we don't want to lose, it comes back to Ernst's first question about the new normal. I mean, we don't want the old normal back again. We want something new that actually takes care of some of these observations that we've had. I don't think we know quite how to do that, but that does seem to be quite important. And I think the other thing I just wanted to throw in, there've been a couple of, we've talked about the not knowing, that was in Ruth's slide, and it's also come up in the comments as well, about the importance of not knowing. And that's something I would also want not to lose. I think the pandemic made it totally acceptable to not know. I mean, nobody knows anything much about the future at the moment. We all know that we don't know, and it's acceptable to not know because nobody could know. So all of a sudden, that is acceptable in a way that it hasn't always been, and yet it is very liberating. For some, I think for some leaders who are used to projecting the idea that they do know, it may be very destabilizing, but it is also quite liberating. And coming back to Bob's reflections on how we worked together as the authorial research team, I think that was a big part of it. We'd set up a Zoom meeting, and we'd start off thinking about what's the next stage or the next problem, or how do we go forward on this project, or how do we do it? And by the end of the hour, we'd have some ideas, which might not, at the beginning we wouldn't know what they were, and at the end of them we'd have them. So somehow there was a space that emerged where ideas could flourish and cross-fertilize, and we'd come out the richer for that at the end. But that would have been much harder if we'd gone in saying, right, I know how we're going to do this, and we're going to do it this way. It was more sort of, how are we going to do this? And so that was part of what made the experience quite rich for us. But again, it's also mirroring, at its best, some of the experiences that people have had to come to terms with over the last few months.
And perhaps it's worth adding that at least one of the groups of our participants were very keen to have a copy of the recording of, because when we had the focus groups and the conversations, we recorded them via Zoom. And there was one group in particular that wanted a copy of the recording, which they could share with their various teams within the organization to generate the kind of conversations that they needed to have, observing on screen and listening to the voices of the leaders who were opening up about their own challenges and so on. And so that that could be fed back into the organization and generate more learning conversations, which will help them in addressing the crisis. So that's a way in which the technology has actually been quite useful. That they've seen their leaders behaving openly and authentically, and then having the opportunity to respond to that.
I think one other thing I would add, seeing some of the comments coming in about taking some of these ideas forward, and somebody's asking about different ways of teaching, taking this forward in terms of management education. At my university, we're having a small series of research webinars on what are the implications of the pandemic for management education. And I've also set it as a research question for some project students in their final master's degree project about how, to what extent has the pandemic changed the way we do human resource management, for example. And I'm hoping that they will come back with something other than everybody's working online, which yes, but maybe something about value and reward and who gets the bonuses, and yet who actually in lockdown, when people around us are ill and dying, actually who are the people who keep society going? Who are the people we really need when the chips are down? I'd be very, very keen to see some students actually grappling with some of those issues, because I think we need to completely rethink human resource management based on these experiences. You know, the idea of executive pay just seems offensive when you look at what key workers have actually been doing and struggling with. So hopefully there will be some ways we can take some of these issues forward.
Thank you. And on that note, I'd like to thank everyone for participating, joining us. Please feel free to get in touch with us for comments or questions. I have asked Ernst whether he or other colleagues could download the chat discussion for us, because I don't seem to be able to do so, but maybe Ruth can. Thank you all for coming today, joining this session, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye for now.
Thank you, Ilaria, for that skillful chairing as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ken.
All right, so thank you very much, everyone. And this was a fantastic session. I'm very, very happy and great that you were joining us on sharing the experiences you've had.